I still remember how the plane doors opened and that tired, recycled air rushed out, and I told myself, okay, just a few more steps, you're almost home, because that's what the holidays are supposed to feel like, right? Home, warmth. Familiar noise, the kind that fills your chest instead of draining it, and after 10 hours squeezed into a seat that never quite lets your knees forget their age, my legs felt like they belonged to someone else, my back ached in that deep. Old way that doesn't complain loudly but never really shuts up either, sigh. I carried that ache with me through the long hallway, past the blinking signs and tired faces, dragging my small suitcase like it was a stubborn child. And all I could think about was a hot shower, a quiet room, maybe sitting on the couch with a blanket and letting someone else make the tea for once, ha ha ha, imagine that, someone making me tea. And as I spotted my son near the pickup area, waving with that familiar half-smile, something in my chest loosened because no matter how old they get, they're still your child and you still feel that pull, that soft awe that says, "This is why you came," and I waved back, adjusting my coat, already rehearsing the hug, the jokes about airport food, the small talk that bridges the space between phone calls and real life. But as I got closer, I noticed he wasn't holding his jacket or his phone like usual. He was holding a bag, a big one, bulky and sagging in the middle, and for a moment my tired brain didn't connect the dots. I just smiled because smiling is easy. It's automatic, especially when you've learned that being pleasant makes things smoother, and he stepped forward, kissed my cheek quickly, the way people do when they're in a rush, and placed the bag into my hands. And that's when my arms dipped slightly under the weight and I felt the familiar shape through the fabric, bottles, wipes, spare clothes, that unmistakable smell of baby powder mixed with something sweet, and my smile froze just a little. Not enough for him to notice, just enough for me to feel it, and before I could even ask, before my mouth could catch up to my thoughts, he said it, casual, almost cheerful, like he was telling me about the weather, "We're flying to Rome." And he nodded toward the curb where a taxi idled, engine humming, and then, like an afterthought, he added, "Enjoy the kids," and there it was, just hanging in the air between us, light as a joke, heavy as a stone, and my mind scrambled. Trying to catch up, Rome kids, diaper bag now, and I wanted to laugh it off to say, "Oh, you're kidding," but his eyes were already drifting past me, scanning for the driver, his body angled away, already moving on. And I realized this wasn't a conversation, it was a transfer, a quiet one, the kind that doesn't ask for permission, and maybe you've felt that moment before when something important is decided without you. When you're informed instead of included, and your chest tightens but your face stays calm, because that's what you've always done, you absorb, you adjust, you manage, ha ha ha, you're good at that, right? Too good sometimes, and as he waved. Actually waved like we were parting on good terms and climbed into the taxi, the door closing with a soft, final thud. I stood there with that bag digging into my palms, the cold air brushing my cheeks, and I didn't chase him. I didn't call out, I didn't argue, I just smiled because in that split second my body did what it's always done. It chose peace over noise, silence over spectacle, and if you're wondering why someone wouldn't speak up, why someone wouldn't protest, ask yourself this: how many times have you swallowed your words because you didn't want to seem difficult, ungrateful, dramatic? How many times have you told yourself, "It's fine, I can handle it," until handling it became your whole identity? And as I turned toward the parking lot, the weight of the bag swinging slightly at my side, I felt that old, familiar mix of responsibility and resignation settle in, the kind that whispers, "This is just how things are," but underneath it, quieter but sharper, something else stirred, something I hadn't felt in a long time, not anger exactly, not yet, more like clarity. Like when fog lifts just enough for you to realize you've been walking in circles, and I remember thinking, this wasn't discussed, this wasn't asked, this was assumed, and assumptions have a funny way of revealing what people really think you're for. And if this story is already making you nod, if you've ever been handed a responsibility dressed up as a favor, take a second, breathe, and if you want to hear how moments like this can quietly change everything, consider subscribing. Because sometimes these stories don't just entertain us, they remind us we're not imagining things, and as I buckled into the car that would take me to their house, the diaper bag resting at my feet like a silent promise I never made. I stared out the window at the passing lights, my reflection staring back, calm, composed, smiling even, but inside something had shifted, something small but steady, and I didn't know exactly what I'd do yet, not in detail, not in steps. But I knew this much, that smile back at the airport wasn't surrender, it was a pause, the kind you take right before you choose differently, and if you think this is where the story turns loud with shouting or tears, sigh, you'd be wrong. Because the quiet moments, the ones where nothing seems to happen, are often the ones that decide everything, and that night, as the city lights faded behind us, I already knew this holiday visit would not end the way anyone expected. Not them, and not even me. The car ride felt longer than it should have, not because of traffic, but because my thoughts kept looping back to that moment at the airport, replaying it from different angles, as if changing the camera position might suddenly make it make sense. And I sat there nodding politely while the driver talked about the weather, about holiday rush, about how airports never sleep, and I answered automatically, yes, oh really, while inside my head kept asking the same quiet question. Did that really just happen? And when we finally pulled up to the house, lights glowing warmly through the windows, wreath on the door, everything looking like one of those holiday cards people send to show how put together their lives are. I took a deep breath before stepping out because I already knew the second I crossed that doorframe, I wouldn't just be a guest, I'd be the solution to a problem I hadn't agreed to solve, and sure enough, the moment I walked in. The noise hit me first, toys clattering, little feet running, voices overlapping, and there they were, the kids, adorable and loud and full of that chaotic energy that somehow both warms and drains you at the same time. They ran to me shouting my name, arms wrapping around my legs, and for a brief second my heart softened, because none of this was their fault, and that's the part that always makes things harder, isn't it? When love and obligation get tangled together so tightly you can't tell where one ends and the other begins, and then I noticed the small details, the ones you only see when you're the one expected to manage everything. The open snacks on the table, the sink already filled with dishes, the list taped to the fridge with bedtimes, meals, activities, emergency numbers, all neatly written, thoughtfully prepared, as if this handoff had been planned carefully. Just not discussed with the one person it would affect the most, and I stood there reading that list while one of the kids tugged at my sleeve asking for juice, another calling for help with a toy, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. That quiet okay, I've got it, because that's what I've always said, even when no one asked. And as the door closed behind me, sealing the house into a new kind of silence, the kind that still hums with leftover noise, it hit me. They hadn't just left for a vacation, they'd left responsibility behind, wrapped it in polite smiles and plane tickets. And for the rest of that afternoon, I moved on autopilot, pouring juice, wiping hands, answering questions. Laughing at silly jokes, ha, pretending I wasn't running on empty. And every now and then, my mind would drift back to the airport again, to that wave from the taxi, and I wondered if he thought about me at all as the car drove away. Or if he simply assumed, like everyone else always had, that I'd handle it because I always do, right? And that's when a strange thought crept in, not loud, not angry, just clear. When did my ability to cope become something others relied on without checking? And maybe you've asked yourself that too. Maybe you've noticed how being dependable slowly turns into being invisible. How people stop asking and start assuming, and later that evening, once the kids were finally tucked in, blankets adjusted, nightlights glowing softly, I sat alone on the edge of the couch, the house finally quiet. And that's when the exhaustion really settled in, the kind that sinks into your bones and makes even lifting your head feel like work. Sigh, I rubbed my temples and laughed softly to myself, not because it was funny, but because sometimes laughter is the only thing that keeps tears from spilling over, and I thought about all the little moments over the years that led here, all the times I rearranged my plans, all the "it's okay, I don't mind." All the holidays where I was helping instead of resting, giving instead of receiving, and I realized this wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern, one I'd helped create by never interrupting it. And that realization didn't make me angry, not yet, it made me sad. A slow, heavy sadness that comes when you see your own role clearly for the first time, and I remember staring at my reflection in the dark TV screen. My face lined with travel fatigue, eyes still kind, still soft, and thinking, is this all I'm expected to be? A helper, a backup plan, a safety net, and as that question hung there unanswered, my phone buzzed on the table. A message lighting up the screen, cheerful emojis, photos of a plane wing against the sunset, a quick "we made it. Thanks again," and I stared at that message longer than I should have, my thumb hovering over the reply field, because for once I didn't know what to say. Every familiar response felt wrong, and instead of answering, I set the phone down. Letting the screen go dark, and in that silence, something inside me shifted again, not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to notice, because when you finally stop reacting, you start seeing options. And as I turned off the lights and headed to bed, the house quiet except for the soft breathing of sleeping children, I felt the weight of what had been placed on me, yes, but I also felt something new alongside it. A growing awareness that this situation, as unfair and unexpected as it was, had shown me something important about myself, about boundaries I'd never drawn and choices I'd always postponed. And if you think this night ended with tears or confrontation, it didn't. It ended with resolve, quiet and steady, the kind that doesn't announce itself. And as I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else's home, I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just a holiday inconvenience, it was a turning point, and what came next wouldn't be loud or messy. But it would change everything in ways no one saw coming. By the third morning, the house had its own rhythm, the kind you don't choose but fall into, and I found myself waking up before the alarm, even before the sun, because my body remembered what it meant to be needed before anyone asked. And as I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of the heater and the distant sound of a child turning in their sleep, I felt that familiar pull to get up quickly, to be ready, to stay ahead of the chaos. But this time, something stopped me, not a loud thought, just a pause, and in that pause, memories started lining up quietly, one after another, like they'd been waiting for me to finally notice them. Memories of other holidays where I arrived tired and left even more tired, of weekends spent helping out that somehow turned into full-time duty, of last-minute requests wrapped in smiles. Of plans changed because it was easier than saying no. Ha ha ha, I used to joke about it, say things like, "Oh, you know me, I'm always the backup plan," and people would laugh, nod, agree. And I never questioned why that label fit so easily, and as I moved through the morning routine, pouring cereal, tying shoes, wiping spills, answering the same question 3 times, my hands working automatically, my mind drifted. And I realized this situation didn't start at the airport. It didn't even start this year. It started slowly, years ago, with small yesies that felt harmless at the time, and maybe you know those yesies. The ones that come out before you fully thought them through, because refusing feels heavier than agreeing, and I remembered telling myself, it's just this once, over and over, until once quietly became always. And no one ever sat me down and said, "We expect you to handle this." It just became understood, like gravity, like something that didn't need explanation, and the strangest part was how normal it all felt, how familiar. How safe even, because when you've spent a lifetime being useful, usefulness starts to feel like love, and questioning it feels selfish. And as I laughed along with the kids at breakfast, their milk mustaches and silly stories pulling a genuine smile from me, I felt that old tug again, the one that says, this is why you do it, because loving them is easy, loving them isn't the problem, but love doesn't mean disappearing. And that thought landed softly but firmly, like a truth that had been circling me for years, waiting for the right moment to settle, and later, while folding tiny socks and mismatched pajamas, I caught myself humming. The way I always do when I'm overwhelmed but pretending I'm fine, and I stopped mid-hum, realizing how often I use little habits like that to smooth over discomfort, to make hard things feel lighter so no one else has to carry them, and I wondered, when did I learn to do that? Because no one is born knowing how to make themselves smaller for the comfort of others, and as the day went on, I started noticing the language people used with me, not cruel, not unkind, just certain phrases like, "You're so good with this," "We couldn't do this without you," "You don't mind, right?" Said as statements instead of questions, and each time my chest tightened just a bit because I realized how rarely anyone waited for my answer. And that's when it hit me, not like a slap, more like a slow realization. That being dependable had quietly trained everyone around me to depend without checking, and I don't say that to blame them entirely, sigh, because patterns are shared things, built together over time. And I had played my part by always stepping in, always smoothing things out, always saying yes even when my body and heart whispered no, and in the quiet moments that afternoon, while the kids napped and the house finally rested, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, staring out the window, and for the first time in a long while I didn't rush to fill the silence, I let it sit, and in that stillness another question surfaced. When I hadn't allowed myself to ask before, what would happen if I stopped being the default? And that question felt dangerous, almost rebellious, because it threatened the version of me everyone expected, the version I'd carefully maintained. But it also felt honest, and honesty has a way of waking you up, and I laughed softly at myself, ha ha ha, imagining the confusion if I didn't immediately jump in, if I paused, if I asked to be considered instead of assumed. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't about this one trip or even this one family. It was about a lifetime of choosing peace for others at the cost of myself, and maybe that sounds dramatic. But when you stack years of small sacrifices together, they start to weigh something, and that weight was finally making itself known, and as evening crept in and the house filled with that soft golden light that always feels a little nostalgic, I felt both tired and strangely awake, like someone who's been sleepwalking and just opened their eyes, and I didn't have a plan yet, not really, no big speech prepared, no dramatic exit imagined. Just a growing certainty that something needed to change, and that change wouldn't come from explaining myself or asking for permission. It would come from choosing differently, quietly, consistently, and as I tucked the kids into bed again, listening to their steady breathing, feeling that familiar mix of love and responsibility settle in, I kissed their foreheads and whispered goodnight, knowing none of this was their fault, knowing they deserved care and stability, but also knowing that I deserved something too, something beyond being endlessly available. And as I turned off the light and closed the door, standing alone in the hallway, I felt that same calm clarity return. The one that had flickered at the airport and grown stronger since, and I realized this pattern, once seen, couldn't be unseen, and if you're wondering what happens when someone who's always been quiet starts to listen to themselves instead, don't assume it leads to shouting or anger. Sometimes it leads to something far more unsettling for others, a calm decision made without noise, and that decision, though still forming, was already on its way. That night, sleep didn't come easily, not because of noise or discomfort, but because my mind felt unusually alert, like it had finally been given permission to wander somewhere new, and I lay there listening to the soft ticking of the clock. The kind that usually fades into the background, but now sounded loud enough to mark every passing second, and with each tick, thoughts surfaced that I'd pushed aside for years, thoughts about how often I'd mistaken endurance for strength, how often I'd told myself that being needed was the same as being valued. It's an easy mistake to make, especially when people praise you for it, and I found myself replaying moments from long ago, not just with my son, but with friends, relatives, even coworkers, moments where my willingness to help had slowly turned into an expectation, and I wondered when exactly I'd crossed that invisible line. The one where offering help becomes being relied upon without consent, and as I shifted in bed, the sheets unfamiliar, the room not quite mine, I felt a tightness in my chest that surprised me, because it wasn't anger, it was grief. A quiet morning for all the times I'd put myself second without even realizing it, and tears welled up before I could stop them, not dramatic sobs, just a few warm drops slipping down my temples, and I let them fall. All because pretending you're fine all the time doesn't leave much space to feel anything else, and in that stillness I asked myself a question that felt both simple and terrifying. What do I actually want? Not what would make things easier for everyone else, not what would keep the peace, but what would give me peace, and I realized how rarely I'd ask that, how quickly I'd learned to silence that question. Because wanting something for yourself can feel selfish when you've built your identity around giving, and as the hours crept by, I thought about the airport again, about that smile I gave, and for the first time I understood it differently. That smile wasn't habit, it was instinct, the instinct to pause, to observe, to protect myself in the only way I knew how, and the more I reflected, the clearer it became that confrontation wouldn't have helped me there. Raising my voice wouldn't have changed years of patterns, because patterns don't break from noise, they break from absence, from someone no longer filling the space they're expected to fill, and that idea settled into me gently like a seed. And I began to see this situation not as a trap, but as information, a clear picture of how things worked when I wasn't consulted, and information, once you have it, changes what you're willing to tolerate, and the next morning. As sunlight spilled into the room and the sounds of the house slowly woke up around me, I felt strangely calm, tired, yes, but grounded, like someone who had reached the bottom of a pool and pushed off, and as I made breakfast again, moving through the motions, I noticed a difference in myself, a slight distance, not coldness, just clarity, and when my phone buzzed with another cheerful update, photos of coffee cups and cobblestone streets, captions full of excitement, I didn't feel the usual pull to respond immediately. Instead, I set the phone down and finished what I was doing, and that small act felt bigger than it should have, like a quiet rebellion. Ha ha ha, imagine that, choosing your own timing. And throughout the day, I paid attention to how often I was tempted to over-explain, to justify, to reassure everyone that I was okay, and each time I stopped myself because I realized something important. No one had explained anything to me when the decision was made, so why did I feel responsible for smoothing it over now? And as the kids played nearby, their laughter filling the room, I watched them with affection, but also with a new awareness that loving them didn't mean accepting every condition placed on that love. And in the afternoon, while they were distracted with a game, I stepped outside for a moment, the cold air sharp against my skin. And I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs completely, like I was making space inside myself again. And in that moment, I made a quiet promise, not out loud, not dramatic, just a simple commitment to myself, that I wouldn't rush to fix what I didn't break, that I wouldn't carry what wasn't handed to me with care, and that promise felt steady, not heavy. And as I went back inside, something shifted again, the way it does when a decision has been made. Even if the details aren't clear yet, and if you're expecting a sudden outburst or a tearful confrontation to come next, this story doesn't move that way, because the most powerful changes often happen without witnesses. In the quiet moments where you finally choose to listen to yourself. And that night, as I lay down again, the ticking clock sounding softer this time, I knew this wasn't just about one holiday or one unexpected responsibility. It was about reclaiming a part of myself I'd set aside for too long, and once you see that possibility, once you feel what it's like to stand in your own corner again, there's no going back to the way things were. And what I decided to do next would surprise them, not because it was cruel or dramatic, but because it was calm, deliberate, and long overdue. By the time I woke up the next morning, the decision had settled into me like a steady heartbeat, not loud, not rushed, just there, and that surprised me, because I'd always imagined big changes arriving with fireworks or panic. But this one came quietly with clarity, and as I stood at the sink washing dishes from breakfast, warm water running over my hands, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was resolved, which felt very different, heavier in a calmer way. And I thought about how often I'd mistaken reacting for acting, how many times I'd responded quickly just to keep things smooth. And this time, I wasn't going to do that, not out of spite, not to teach anyone a lesson, but because I finally understood something simple and uncomfortable, that if I kept behaving the same way, nothing around me would ever change, and maybe you felt that too. That moment when you realize waiting for someone else to notice your exhaustion is pointless, because people rarely notice what benefits them, and as the kids played nearby, arguing over a toy and then laughing 2 seconds later, I watched them and felt that familiar warmth again. All love doesn't disappear just because you set boundaries. Love can exist alongside limits, and that thought gave me permission to think practically instead of emotionally, and practicality, I've learned, is where real power often hides, and instead of drafting a message or rehearsing a speech in my head like I used to, I did something different. I made a list not of complaints but of facts, calm, undeniable facts about my time, my energy, my responsibilities, and what I could reasonably give without breaking myself, and writing it down felt grounding, like putting scattered thoughts into neat lines, and as I wrote, I noticed how little of it was dramatic, how reasonable it all sounded when stripped of guilt, and I laughed softly. Ha ha ha, it's funny how things only seem unreasonable when we're trained to accept less than we deserve, and throughout the day, I resisted the urge to overperform, to prove I was handling everything perfectly. Instead, I moved at a steady pace, doing what needed to be done, no more, no less, and that alone felt radical. Because slowing down meant I could actually feel my body again, the tiredness, yes, but also a sense of control returning, and in the quiet moments, I imagined how this would play out, not in dramatic scenes but in small, deliberate steps, because big declarations invite arguments, and I wasn't interested in arguing. I was interested in changing the situation. And if you're listening to this and thinking, I wish I could do that, but my situation is different, pause for a second, because that's what I used to tell myself too, until I realized that different doesn't mean impossible, it just means uncomfortable. And discomfort is something we often endure for others without realizing we can endure it for ourselves as well. And somewhere between lunch and the afternoon lull, while the kids were absorbed in a cartoon, I felt the urge to reach for my phone, to check for updates, to see if anyone had noticed my silence yet, and I stopped myself, because urgency has a way of pulling us back into old roles, and instead I sat there breathing, letting the quiet stretch. And if stories like this feel uncomfortably familiar, if you've ever been the one everyone depends on without asking, consider subscribing. Because sometimes hearing these moments reflected back helps us understand our own. And as evening approached, the house filled with that end-of-day tiredness, and I realized this was the moment where I usually reassured everyone. Sent messages, smoothed things over, but I didn't. I cooked dinner, I listened to the kids talk about their day, I cleaned up, and I kept my focus where it belonged, on what was actually in front of me. And that night, after the kids were asleep, I revisited my list, adjusting it slightly, making it more precise, not harsher, just clearer. And clarity, I've learned, doesn't need to be defended, it just needs to be upheld. And as I prepared for bed, brushing my teeth, looking at my reflection, I noticed something subtle but important. I looked lighter, not rested, but lighter, like someone who had put down a bag they'd been carrying for too long without realizing how heavy it was. And lying there in the dark, I didn't feel anxious about what might happen next. I felt prepared, and preparation is what turns fear into confidence, and I knew the next step wouldn't involve confrontation or emotional appeals. It would involve action, small, calm, undeniable action, the kind that doesn't ask for permission or approval. And if you think that sounds cold, sigh, it wasn't. It was kind, kinder than continuing to silently resent a role I'd outgrown. And as sleep finally crept in, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me, the kind that doesn't rush or second-guess itself, and I knew that once morning came, I'd begin doing something different, not loudly, not dramatically, but deliberately, and that difference, once set in motion, would be impossible to ignore. Morning arrived with a strange sense of calm, the kind that usually comes after a decision has already been made, and as I moved through the house, packing lunches, tying shoelaces, reminding someone to brush their teeth, I noticed how steady my hands felt, how my thoughts weren't racing ahead like they normally did, and that's when I knew this wasn't hesitation, it was resolve. And instead of reaching for my phone first thing, instead of checking messages or waiting for instructions that never came anyway, I followed the plan I'd quietly put together, step by step, nothing dramatic, nothing cruel, just clear, practical actions that respected my limits. And as I drove the kids to school, their chatter filling the car, I listened and smiled, because none of what I was about to do changed how much I loved them. it just changed how much of myself I was willing to give away without thought. And after dropping them off, I didn't rush back home to keep busy like I usually would. Instead, I parked the car and sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing, allowing myself to feel the weight of what I was about to set in motion, and it felt oddly empowering to know I didn't need to announce anything for it to matter, because actions speak even when words don't. And when I got back to the house, I gathered what I needed calmly: paperwork, schedules, contact information, all the things that had been handed to me without discussion, and I organized them neatly, not out of obligation, but out of respect for myself. Because I refused to turn my boundaries into chaos for anyone else. And maybe that sounds strange, but clarity is a kindness, even when it's firm. And as the afternoon went on, I took care of only what was necessary. No extra favors, no invisible labor, just what was reasonable, and that alone shifted the energy in the house, because when you stop overextending, the silence where your effort used to be becomes noticeable. And I remember laughing softly to myself, ha ha ha, because for the first time I wasn't exhausted by the end of the day. I was tired, yes, but not drained. And in the late afternoon, I finally sent a message, not emotional, not accusing. Just clear, outlining what I could do and what I couldn't, simple sentences, no explanations, no apologies, and my finger hovered over the send button for a second longer than necessary, not because I doubted myself, but because old habits die hard. And then I sent it. And that single action felt like stepping onto solid ground after years of balancing on something unsteady, and the reply didn't come immediately, which told me everything I needed to know. Because when people are used to instant access to you, boundaries feel like silence. And as evening approached, my phone buzzed, and this time the tone was different: questions instead of assumptions, concern instead of cheer. And I read the message without rushing to respond, letting myself sit with it, because urgency had never been mine to carry. And as I cooked dinner, the kids asking about their parents, about when they'd be back, I answered honestly but gently, not filling in the gaps with reassurances I couldn't promise. And that honesty felt clean, like clearing fog from a mirror. And if you're listening to this thinking that setting boundaries will automatically make you the villain, pause for a second, because what often changes first isn't how others see you, it's how you see yourself, and that shift alone is powerful. And that night, as I tucked the kids into bed, their arms wrapping around me in that sleepy way, whispering goodnight, I felt that familiar tenderness again, awe, and I knew loving them didn't require me to abandon myself. And after the house went quiet, my phone buzzed again, this time with a longer message, the tone unmistakably different: confusion, a hint of panic, maybe even regret, and instead of feeling satisfaction, I felt calm. Because calm is what comes when you're no longer negotiating your worth. And I replied once more, briefly, sticking to what I'd already said, no extra justifications, no emotional padding. And as I set the phone down, I realized something important had happened. Not just externally, but internally, I trusted myself to follow through, and that trust felt better than any apology ever could. And if you think the next part of this story is where everything resolves neatly, sigh, it isn't, because change rarely happens all at once. But once you take that first quiet step, once you act instead of explain, there's no going back to pretending things are fine. And the reactions that followed, the ones I didn't expect, were only just beginning. The next morning, I woke to a phone vibrating on the bedside table, not once but again and again, the kind of insistence that used to send me into a rush of guilt before my eyes were even fully open. And for a moment, out of habit, my hand twitched toward it, ready to apologize for whatever I hadn't done yet. But then I stopped, took a breath, and let it ring a little longer. And that pause changed everything, because when I finally picked it up, I wasn't bracing myself, I was steady, and the voice on the other end sounded different from the cheerful updates and casual assumptions I'd grown used to. It was tight, rushed, layered with questions. Wait, what do you mean you can't keep doing this? And I listened without interrupting, letting the words tumble out, because people reveal a lot when they're suddenly unsure. And as I listened, I noticed how quickly the story shifted from excitement about Rome to concern about logistics, schedules, childcare, plans that apparently depended on me more than anyone had admitted. And there it was. The proof I hadn't needed but somehow still appreciated, the confirmation that my role had been far bigger than anyone ever acknowledged. And instead of feeling vindicated, I felt clear, and clarity is calm. And when I finally spoke, my voice surprised even me. It didn't shake, it didn't rise, it simply stated what I'd already said, calmly, kindly, without blame. And the silence on the other end stretched longer than usual, because when you stop filling space, others are forced to face it. And then came the messages, one after another, texts replacing calls, apologies mixed with confusion, explanations suddenly offered for decisions I hadn't been included in. And I watched it all unfold with a strange sense of distance, like observing a storm from behind a window, aware of its force but no longer inside it. And I realized something important in that moment. Panic often looks like concern when convenience is threatened, and recognizing that doesn't harden your heart, it strengthens your spine, and as the day went on, the tone continued to shift. From "this is just temporary" to "we didn't realize it would be this hard" to "can we talk about this when we get back?" And each message felt like another brick falling from a structure that had been built on my silence. And I didn't celebrate that, I simply noticed it, because noticing is different from gloating, and throughout it all, I stayed present with the kids, helping with homework, listening to stories about school, laughing at silly jokes. Ha ha ha, because life didn't pause just because adults were uncomfortable, and that was another realization that settled in. Things keep moving whether or not you rush to smooth them out, and by the afternoon, the calls slowed, replaced by longer pauses, and in those pauses, something else emerged: respect, hesitant at first, awkward but real, because when people realize you won't immediately bend, they start adjusting instead. And that adjustment wasn't loud or dramatic, it showed up in different words, in questions that actually waited for answers, in plans that suddenly included my input, and I felt a quiet sadness alongside that shift, not for myself, but for the years it took to get here, years where this respect could have existed if I'd allowed it sooner. And as evening approached, another message came through, softer this time, more reflective, acknowledging how much had been placed on me without discussion, and reading it, I felt a mix of relief and grief, relief that things were finally being seen, grief that they'd gone unseen for so long, and I didn't rush to respond. Because I no longer needed to prove anything by being immediate, and that alone felt like growth. And if you've ever wondered whether setting boundaries means losing love, listen closely, because what often changes first isn't love. It's the way people access you, and access is not the same thing as affection. And that night, as I sat in the quiet living room, lights dimmed, the house finally still, I reflected on how quickly the dynamic had shifted once I stopped holding it up by myself, and it made me realize how much invisible work goes unnoticed until it stops, and maybe that's uncomfortable for others. But discomfort is sometimes the beginning of fairness, and as I headed to bed, phone silent at last, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel at all: peace, not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer carrying what wasn't mine alone to carry, and I knew that when they returned, when the excitement of travel faded and reality set back in, the conversation would be very different from any we'd had before. And what happened then, the moment we were finally face to face again, would test everything I'd just learned to hold steady. When the house finally settled into its nighttime quiet again, after the kids were asleep and the last light was turned off, something unexpected crept in alongside the calm, guilt, slow and heavy, the kind that doesn't shout but whispers. And I sat there on the edge of the couch, feeling it press against my chest, wondering if I'd gone too far, if I'd been unfair, if choosing myself meant I was somehow failing at being a mother. Because guilt has a way of dressing itself up as responsibility, and for a moment I let it speak, let it list all the reasons I should backtrack, apologize, soften my words, fix things the way I always had. Sigh, it's exhausting how convincing that voice can be, especially when it sounds like love, and I thought about the kids, their sleepy faces, their small hands trusting without question, and my heart ached. Because loving them is the easiest thing in the world, and that's exactly why this felt so hard. And then another thought followed, quieter but steadier. What am I teaching them if I erase myself every time things get uncomfortable? And that question lingered, because children learn more from what we tolerate than what we say, and I realized that showing them care didn't require showing them self-neglect, and that realization didn't erase the guilt, but it reshaped it, turned it into something I could examine instead of obey. And as I sat there, I remembered all the times I'd felt guilty for resting, for saying no, for wanting time that belonged only to me. And I wondered why guilt always showed up when I chose myself, but rarely appeared when others chose themselves without a second thought. And that imbalance suddenly felt important, like a clue I'd been ignoring, and I laughed softly. Ha ha ha, not because it was funny, but because it was so obvious once I finally saw it. And the next day, the guilt followed me around quietly, showing up in small moments when I hesitated before sitting down, when I almost apologized for nothing, when I caught myself thinking I should do more, and each time I paused, breathed, and asked myself one simple question: is this love or is this habit? And that question became my anchor. Because habits can be changed, even the ones we've worn for decades, and as messages came in, some warm, some awkward, some still edged with discomfort, I noticed how my urge to overexplain softened. Because I no longer needed approval to feel justified, and that was new, and honestly, a little unsettling, because when you stop seeking validation, you're left alone with your own truth, and that requires trust. And trusting myself felt like learning a new language, slow and awkward at first, but meaningful. And as the days passed, the guilt lost some of its sharpness, turning into something duller, easier to carry. And I realized guilt often flares brightest right before a boundary takes hold, like a final test, and passing it doesn't mean you feel brave, it means you stay anyway. And one evening, while sitting with the kids as they colored at the table, crayons scattered everywhere, laughter bubbling up over silly drawings, I felt that familiar warmth again, and this time it wasn't tangled with resentment or exhaustion, it was clean. And that surprised me because I hadn't lost closeness by setting limits, I'd gained presence, and presence, I was learning, is far more valuable than constant availability. And later that night, alone again, I thought about how easy it would have been to slip back into old patterns, to smooth everything over and pretend this had never happened, and how tempting that still felt, because comfort is familiar even when it hurts. But then I thought about the quiet strength I'd felt these past days, the steadiness, the self-respect, and I knew I couldn't unlearn that, even if I wanted to. And if you've ever felt guilty for choosing yourself, listen carefully. Because guilt doesn't always mean you're doing something wrong, sometimes it means you're doing something new. And that night, as I turned off the light and lay down, the house quiet and safe, I made peace with the discomfort. Understanding that growth rarely feels good in the moment, but it always leaves you stronger, and I knew that when the time came to see them again, when words would finally be exchanged face to face, I wouldn't be shrinking or apologizing. I'd be standing calmly in my truth, and that, more than anything else, would change how this story ended. By the time they were due to return, the house felt different, not quieter, not emptier, just steadier, like furniture that had finally been placed where it belonged instead of shoved aside to make room for everyone else. And I noticed the change in myself first, in the way I moved through the day without rushing, in how I didn't jump every time my phone buzzed, in how my shoulders didn't stay permanently tense waiting for the next request. And that surprised me because I'd assumed relief would only come once everything was resolved, but instead, it arrived the moment I stopped fighting myself. And as the days passed, messages became shorter, more careful, less assumed. And I could tell something had shifted on the other side too, because when expectations change, people feel it even from far away. And one afternoon, while the kids were outside playing, their laughter drifting through the open window, I sat at the table with a cup of tea and realized something quietly profound. No one had collapsed because I stopped overextending, nothing had fallen apart, the world hadn't ended. Sigh, all that had really changed was that I wasn't holding everything up alone anymore, and that realization felt like a deep exhale I'd been holding for years. And when the day of their return finally arrived, I didn't feel dread the way I used to before difficult conversations. I felt curious to see who would walk through that door now that the rules were different. And as I prepared the house, not obsessively, just thoughtfully, I noticed how natural it felt to do only what was necessary, not what was expected. And when the kids asked when their parents would be back, I answered simply, without filling the space with reassurance or excuses. And that honesty felt respectful, not just to them but to me. And when the car finally pulled into the driveway, gravel crunching softly, my heart beat a little faster, not with fear but with awareness, because this moment mattered. And as the door opened and familiar voices filled the space again, I observed more than I spoke, noticing the hesitation, the way eyes searched my face, the slight uncertainty in their movements, and that uncertainty told me everything. Because people sense when they no longer hold the same power, and the conversation that followed wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just careful words, pauses, and for the first time, questions that waited for answers. And when I spoke, I didn't explain the past or justify my feelings. I spoke about the present, about what worked and what didn't, about what I could offer and what I couldn't. And saying it out loud felt surprisingly easy because I'd already said it to myself, and that internal agreement made all the difference. And I watched as the reality settled in for them, not all at once but gradually. Like understanding dawns when you finally stop denying it, and there was an apology, not perfect, not polished, but real enough, and instead of rushing to accept it, to smooth things over and make everyone comfortable, I let it sit. Because apologies don't need immediate forgiveness to be meaningful, they need change, and that was the part I was interested in now. And over the next few days, that change began to show itself in small but noticeable ways. Plans discussed instead of assumed, help requested instead of expected, gratitude expressed instead of implied, and each small shift reinforced something inside me, that boundaries don't push people away when they're healthy. They teach people how to stay, and there were moments, of course, when old habits tried to resurface. Little comments, familiar tones, but this time I noticed them, and noticing gave me choice, and instead of reacting, I responded calmly. Redirecting without drama, and the ease of that surprised me most of all. Ha ha ha, I used to think standing up for myself would feel exhausting, but it felt lighter than constantly giving in, and as the household found its new balance, I realized something else too. I was enjoying the kids more, truly enjoying them, because my time with them wasn't tangled up in resentment or fatigue anymore. It was intentional, present, warm. And that presence felt like a gift we were all receiving, and one evening, as I watched them fall asleep, their breathing slow and even, I felt a quiet pride, not the loud kind that demands recognition, but the kind that settles deep in your chest and stays, pride in having chosen differently, even when it was uncomfortable, even when guilt tried to pull me back, and I thought about how easily this story could have gone another way. How close I'd been to swallowing everything again just to keep things smooth, and how much I would have lost if I had. And if you're listening to this wondering whether it's too late to change a pattern you've lived with for years, hear this. It isn't. But it does require you to tolerate a little discomfort at first, because discomfort is often the doorway to something healthier. And as I stood there in the quiet hallway, lights dimmed, house settled, I understood that this chapter wasn't about punishment or payback, it was about balance, and balance doesn't announce itself loudly, it shows up in how you feel at the end of the day, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at ease, and yet, even in that calm, I knew there was one final piece to this story, one last realization that would tie everything together, because change doesn't end with others adjusting, it ends when you fully accept the new version of yourself. And that acceptance, the hardest and most important part, was still unfolding. In the days that followed, after the house had settled into its new rhythm and the noise of return had softened into something familiar again, I found myself thinking less about what had happened and more about who I had become because of it. And that felt like the real ending of this story, not the airport, not the messages, not even the apologies, but this quiet shift inside me, the one that didn't announce itself but stayed, and I noticed it in small moments. Like when I woke up and didn't immediately scan my mind for who needed me first, or when I sat with a cup of tea and actually tasted it instead of drinking it cold hours later. It's strange how peace often arrives so quietly you almost miss it if you're not paying attention, and I realized that for years I'd believed being good meant being endlessly available, endlessly patient, endlessly understanding. And while those qualities aren't wrong, they become heavy when they're one-sided, and it took this unexpected holiday, this moment of being handed a responsibility without consent, to finally show me that kindness without boundaries slowly turns into self-erasure. And I don't say that with bitterness, I say it with clarity, because clarity doesn't need anger to be true, and as I moved through each day, I noticed how differently people interacted with me now, more pauses, more checking in, more awareness, and while part of me wished this respect had existed sooner, another part of me understood something important. People can only respect boundaries they can see, and I hadn't shown mine before, and that realization didn't feel like blame, it felt like ownership, and ownership is empowering. Ha ha ha, who knew that such a simple thing could feel so freeing, and there were still moments, of course, when old instincts flared up, when I felt the urge to smooth things over, to jump in before being asked, to say yes just to avoid discomfort, but now I noticed those urges instead of obeying them, and noticing gave me choice, and choice gave me peace, and one evening, while sitting quietly as the kids played nearby, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for them but for myself, for having finally listened to that small, steady voice inside me that had been asking for care too. And I thought about how many people live their lives thinking strength looks like endurance, when sometimes strength looks like stopping, like saying, "This is enough," and I wondered how different my life might have been if I'd learned that sooner. But then I smiled, because timing matters less than learning, and learning is never wasted, no matter when it arrives, and if you're hearing this story and recognizing pieces of yourself in it. If you've ever smiled through exhaustion or accepted responsibility without being asked, know this: you're not weak for caring, but you're allowed to care about yourself too, and that balance, once found, changes everything. And as the days turned into a comfortable routine again, I noticed how my relationships felt lighter, more honest, not because everyone was suddenly perfect, but because I wasn't silently carrying resentment anymore. And that honesty created space for real connection instead of obligation, and one afternoon, while folding laundry, something I'd done 1,000 times before, I caught myself humming again. But this time it wasn't a way to push discomfort away, it was simple contentment, awe, and that small difference made me pause, because it reminded me how much of my life had been lived in quiet tension. Tension I'd mistaken for normal, and now that it was gone, I could finally feel the difference, and as I reflected on everything that had happened, I realized this story wasn't about punishment or revenge or even standing up to someone else. It was about standing with myself, about finally treating my own needs as worthy of consideration, and that might sound small. But it's revolutionary when you've spent a lifetime putting yourself last, and when I think back to that moment at the airport, to the smile I gave as the taxi drove away, I see it differently now, not as resignation, but as the beginning of something new, the moment I chose to pause instead of react, to observe instead of argue, and that pause changed the entire course of what followed, and maybe that's the real lesson here. That sometimes the most powerful response isn't immediate or loud, It's thoughtful, delayed, intentional, and if this story stayed with you. If it made you think about the ways you show up for others and whether you show up for yourself the same way, I hope you'll carry that reflection with you, because stories like this aren't meant to tell you what to do. They're meant to remind you what's possible, and if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about quiet strength, unexpected turning points, and finding yourself again in the middle of everyday life, consider subscribing. Because sometimes the stories we need most are the ones that sound a little too familiar, and as I close this chapter of my life, I do so without regret, without anger, and without the need to explain myself anymore. Because I've learned something simple and powerful: that peace doesn't come from being needed by everyone else, it comes from being honest with yourself, and once you find that, once you really feel it settle in your chest, you realize you never lost your voice at all, you were just waiting for the right moment to use it.